Good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome both those in the room with us and those watching online to this evening talks by Lisa Conte, Head of Conservation at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. This is the second of 3 events taking place today as part of Fairfield University's College of Arts and Sciences commemoration of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Lisa's talk, along with photographer Joseph McNally's talk earlier this afternoon, are co-sponsored by the museum and the Quick Center. At 7 p.m. this evening, in the 3rd event of the series, Fairfield faculty member and writer Phil Clay will be in virtual conversation with journalist George Packer. In his opening remarks earlier today, Richard Greenwald, the Dean of Fairfield's College of Arts and Sciences, observed that 20 years is a long time. He noted that for our students, 9/11 has become a historical event, while for those who lived through it, it remains burned in our minds. Lisa's talk this evening offers another perspective on the aftermath of this event, one tied to the material artifacts that have been preserved in the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. Lisa Conte has been the head of conservation at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum since 2017. She earned her master's in art history and her certificate of advanced study in conservation at the NYU Institute of Fine Arts. Previously, Lisa has worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Scott Gerson Conservation, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. Lisa is a modern and contemporary works on paper specialist, and she's especially interested in the history and technology of prints and other reproductions. Her recent publications include Watercolors of the Acropolis, Émile Gilleron in Athens in the Met Bulletin, and The Slurry Wall, Past, Present, and Future in Studies in Conservation. Her current research has focused on the ethics and preservation of spontaneous memorials at public sites that commemorate loss and political and social crises. Her talk this evening is part of the Edwin L. Weisl Jr. Lectureships in Art History, funded by the Robert Lehman Foundation. For those watching online, you can ask questions in the quick live chat, and we also have microphones here in the Kelly Theater for those who may wish to ask questions after the talk. And now I hope our audiences, both virtual and live, will join me in welcoming Lisa Conte.
Thank you, Michelle, and I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Carrie Weber and Kathy Schwab, who gave me the opportunity to be here today to share my work with you. It's so nice to be in person and to be in a new place, and I hope that I have an opportunity to meet some of you after the talk. We're just going to make sure we can advance the slides. Let's see. Okay. I think I'm having just a little bit of technical difficulty. Yep, there we go. Okay, great. Sorry. Here we go. Take 2. The World Trade Center site, which I'll be talking about today, is sacred land. It's located on the traditional homeland of the Lenape people, the first residents of Lower Manhattan, who called the island Manhattan, meaning hilly island. After the Dutch arrived around 400 years ago, they entered into various land deals with them, but the Lenape were eventually forced from their homeland by expanding European colonies. I want to pay my respect to the Lenape people and acknowledge the land's ongoing significance for the Lenape nations today. As I've recognized my responsibility towards the Lenape people, I also recognize the people killed on 9/11, who died because of exposure to toxins at Ground Zero, and the countless others now sick or suffering because of that day and since. Finally, I acknowledge the individuals who played a part in preserving the tangible and intangible heritage that helps us interpret 9/11's complex history today. The information in this presentation may be sensitive for some audience members. I've been attentive to this in my slide selection and have placed a red star in the corner of the slides to indicate that the following slide will contain images related to traumatic heritage. On September 11th, I was about the same age as many of you. I was a recent college graduate trying to find my way. After working for 2 years at a New York City gallery specializing in American art, I set out in the summer of 2001 for what has now become a popularized lifestyle in social media known as van life. I was camping in Lake Tahoe on 9/11 with someone that had a cell phone, a rarity for the time. Even more astonishing was that we must have had service as the phone rang around 6 a.m. Pacific time with the news that planes had crashed into the Twin Towers. We packed up and headed for somewhere with the TV. At the turn of the century, as you may recall, it was still the primary medium for the news. It has been estimated that 90% of Americans were principally informed about the attacks from television, compared with just 5% who got their information online. I couldn't have imagined then that I would today have the great responsibility of safekeeping and caretaking the stories and things that would help tell this monumental history. And as a conservator, that much of my work would be focused on the preservation of damage and the harsh truths that it evokes. Yet, closely learning about the human experience of 9/11 continually surprises me and helps me navigate the sometimes difficult aspects of this history. I appreciate the opportunity to share my work with you and information about the 9/11 Memorial Museum's collection. 9/11 represents an unprecedented moment in modern history. It is the greatest cataclysm recorded and witnessed in real time. Nearly 1/3 of the world's population watched the devastation as it unfolded in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, an astounding statistic in a time before iPhones and social media. Today, images of the Twin Towers engulfed by flames and the chaotic sight of the entangled steel remains at ground zero, pictured on television that day, endure in our minds, regardless of whether we witness the attacks firsthand. The pervasive accumulation of dust on both people and things after the towers collapsed likewise became one of the most lasting images of the day. These startling graphic images are now a part of our collective memory. However, they sometimes obscure a much more complex history, the humanity of the plane's passengers, the Pentagon and Trade Center's occupants, their manifold histories, and how our lives continue to be shaped by the event 20 years later. We have all experienced 9/11's aftershocks, some of us more than others. We grapple with the political, psychological, and physical hazards in many forms as an extension of this tragic day. Families and friends have grieved and commemorated their lost loved ones. Members of the 9/11 survivor and recovery communities and residents of Lower Manhattan continue to battle and succumb to illnesses because of their exposure to World Trade Center dust and toxins, ranging from cancer to post-traumatic stress disorder and now vulnerability to COVID-19. Some communities have even continue to be and have been the victims of discrimination or hate crimes because of their ethnicity or religion. And America has engaged in wars, resulting in thousands of casualties and trillions of dollars in military spending. Alongside these exceedingly difficult parts of 9/11's history, it's powerful to remember how people came together in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 in beautifully human ways as they faced a collective traumatic experience. In New York City, first responders, residents, and even celebrities worked in tandem at Ground Zero to recover the dead, clean the site, and offer one another comfort. Others expressed their empathy and grief by holding vigils throughout the city, and some paid tribute to those affected by creating things. Spontaneous memorials, missing posters, American flags, signs of solidarity and protest, and public health notices proliferated. Artists confronted the personal, social, and political implications of 9/11 in their work, sometimes incorporating material markers of the event itself, such as World Trade Center dust. In 2005, philosopher Arthur Danto reflected on the two truths he learned from the 9/11 attacks. The first was that, quote, "the moral aftereffect of tragedy is a mutual commiseration among survivors," end quote. And the second truth was that even the most ordinary people respond to tragedy with art, and how that art can deeply embody grief. 20 years later, as 9/11 enters history, museums like the 9/11 Memorial Museum play an increasingly important role in the dialogue of this past. They are the keepers of artifacts and memories that manifest truths like those observed by Danto, and that will shape this history over time. The 9/11 Memorial Museum's material culture holdings are extensive, speaking tangibly to the human experience of 9/11. Artifacts in the collection spanned the World Trade Center's construction and destruction, They vary widely in medium, scale, and inherent condition, containing evidence of the event, memorial and tribute items, artworks, historical records, and oral reminiscences. Because the institution occupies the site of the atrocity, our work is especially driven by empathy and respect for those who died. Collecting goals support the museum's mission to commemorate the human toll of 9/11 and the consequences of terrorism on our lives. The familiar outlines of the original World Trade Center are preserved within the 9/11 Memorial Museum, which opened in 2014. At street level, the memorial pools occupy the footprints of the North and South Towers, and nearly 70 feet below them in the museum, the severed remnants of the building box columns evoke the tower's history and magnitude. These architectural elements, as well as the slurry wall, a water-blocking wall made of reinforced concrete seen in this slide, were preserved under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This was mainly because of the tireless advocacy of victims' families who considered the site sacred. On February 6, 2004, the World Trade Center site was deemed eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, an extraordinary exception to the general rule that a site had to be at least 50 years old to be included. Yet, the heart of the movable collection resides, even though it is just a small part of it, in the artifacts that represent the culmination of a rapid response collecting effort that began within days of the attack and lasted through 2002. The artifacts that were saved include colossal pieces of steel, crushed rescue vehicles, vestiges of the hijacked aircraft, as well as office relics like business cards and floppy disks. A unifying characteristic of these artifacts, beyond their telltale condition, is that they were all exposed to World Trade Center dust. The same is true of many other objects that were later acquired from survivors, victims' families, and others. For the rest of this talk, I will focus on the history of this part of the collection, focusing on the effort in New York. I will consider what were the challenges that faced museum professionals involved, how is the evolving interpretive values of these artifacts realized, and then how does all of this inform the preservation of the collection? Recognizing that there is no one model for this practice, the discussion will also consider the collecting and caretaking strategies of other institutions and individuals to reflect on ethics, collecting protocols, and responsibility to the communities where the art or artifacts came into existence. First, I'll give a brief overview of rapid response collecting. I'm especially interested in this part of the collection because it represents the visceral response of museum professionals, survivors, first responders, artists, volunteers, family, and community members to gather evidence for the future. They wanted people to understand what happened and the talismans people used in real time to survive it. Rapid response collecting is a collecting methodology used to acquire artifacts when history is happening rather than in hindsight. This approach to collecting allows for a more inclusive archive, as many things are lost after an event ends. Collecting in real time also allows the documentation of context, how things were used and experienced, which helps give an artifact its evidentiary value and meaning. The practice has become increasingly used since 9/11, which is among the earliest cited instances of it at a significant scale. In recent years, museum professionals and communities have engaged in this type of field work to source items that relate to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Women's March in Washington in 2017, to name a few. There are, of course, challenges, though, to preserving artifacts in real time, such as spontaneous memorials. Time is of the essence in these collecting scenarios because with physical items, like an outdoor memorial, the condolence notes that may be part of it were not usually made with longevity in mind. Public memorial sites inevitably change over time because of an accumulation of often vulnerable objects and because they are susceptible to external forces. And when collecting material witnesses of significant moments in recent history, no one can know for sure which artifacts will be historically significant or when it is appropriate to collect. This process diverges from more traditional models of collecting, which seek items for a collection because they already have taken on a specific value to history. Rapid response collecting is a meaningful activity because it can capture the zeitgeist of an era. It often results in the acquisition of the material culture of everyday people, which can help museum collections become more reflective and inclusive for the communities they serve. The Smithsonian, for example, has recently used a rapid response strategy to collect the scrubs of the first nurse to receive the COVID-19 vaccine and the suit worn by Democratic Representative Andy Kim on January 6th as he cleaned the Capitol following the insurrection. Artifacts like these carry evidence of the past into the future from which we can create historical accounts. But curators and other museum professionals, for the most part, can't create narratives using artifacts alone, at least not objectively. Artifacts rely on supporting documentation like photographs and first-person testimony to be reliable witnesses to history. When acquired without useful data, the stories of artifacts will need some invention to be realized. Similarly, remembrances, and what I mean here are primary sources, are also not entirely objective. They are memories, and memories are fallible. Memory and history are distinct, but they can support and challenge one another. Because all collecting processes are elective and selective, how artifacts are collected and collections are shaped is equally essential to preserving history as the objects themselves. These intangible values help us understand the cultural, political, and social circumstances of a given time and what its people determined worthy of becoming history. On October 4th, 2001, an important meeting was held at the Museum of the City of New York entitled The Role of a History Museum in a Time of Crisis. Over 30 institutions were in attendance, each poised to collect the eyewitness objects to this unprecedented moment in American history. One of the curators reflected, quote, "While it was too recent to evaluate the larger historical perspective, it was clear that it was something we had to document," end quote. The most passionately debated topic at the meeting was collecting, whether to collect and what, when, and how to collect materials from that day. People were rightfully uneasy about the prospect of collecting so soon after the attacks because of concerns about the ongoing memorial value of the material and its emotional resonance, especially for the family and friends of those missing or killed. And of course, in the days that followed 9/11, the search for survivors, removal of human remains, quest for criminal evidence, and containment of dangerous conditions took precedence over any salvage operation focused on the recovery of the tangible contents of the World Trade Center history. Following the meeting, a website, 911history.net, was created where cultural institutions could share updates and the public could post ideas. A steering committee was established and representatives from it sent a resolution to the Port Authority, the owners of the World Trade Center, seeking to work together to preserve from the ruins at Ground Zero and later Fresh Kills landfill artifacts for the sake of history. The Port Authority acquiesced, and in addition to collecting for their institutions, work was also undertaken for a presumed memorial. This was how the 9/11 Memorial Museum's embryonic collection started, thanks to these real-time efforts. The Fresh Kills landfill, seen here, is where the approximately 1.5 million tons of debris excavated from the Trade Center was taken to sort through. Curators navigated these sites with the help of government officials, law enforcement, and staff from the Port Authority. As you can see, the site was extensive. Collecting efforts were structured by the earlier exchange of ideas, which included lists of artifacts that curators aspired to recover. The beginning of the process was tenuous. It was hard to know what would be found amidst the debris. The intensity of the fires that burned and the collapse of both 110-story high-rises, resulting in most of the material record contained within them to be destroyed. What was not incinerated was fragmentized by the force of the cascading building. Curators optimistically sought things like clocks that could potentially show the time of the collapse, floor directories, emergency stairway handwells to illustrate people's paths to survival, and items that reflected the internationalism of the tenants, but also things that would represent workplace culture and the technology of the time at the turn of the century. And of course, they sought things to remember people's lives. Numerous trips to Ground Zero and the Fresh Kills landfill secured many of the things I just mentioned, in addition to found World Trade Center signage, file cabinets, voluminous amounts of singed and torn paper, elevator gears, abandoned bicycles, crushed emergency vehicles, and twisting building remains, most covered in dust and debris. Other collection methods, including the Port Authority using orange spray paint, as seen here, to indicate objects to be saved, a technique that was ultimately successful to the surprise of curators. At that point, what was permitted to be acquired was mostly objects without any forensic value or relation to specific individuals, such as wallets, identification cards, clothing, shoes, and jewelry. Such evidence of personhood are now among the most poignant objects in the 9/11 Memorial Museum's collection. These were first returned to the victims' families or the individuals to whom they belonged. Depending upon where and by whom artifacts were collected, recall civilians were collecting in these moments too. The damage and where exhibited could have different evidentiary and historic value. At fresh kills, objects continued to be compromised by the environments from which they were salvaged, such as exposure to the elements, being moved and sorted with heavy machinery, and cleaning by NYPD done for the sake of safety. World Trade Center dust, as you likely know, was by then a known hazard, as well as for appearance, so that the returned personal effects, in particular, would not fully bear the trauma that they witnessed. Collecting in New York continued for about 8 months through the end of the official rescue, recovery, and cleanup operations in May 2002. But as much as was collected, there were also precious items passed over. One curator reflected on how she chose not to collect the day she visited Ground Zero because, quote, emotions were too raw to approach people about donating items to a museum, end quote. In 2006, an unexpected discovery of buried World Trade Center debris and human remains was made at the site, and New York City's Office of Chief Medical Examiner, OCME, was given the task of systematically searching the site for any remaining victims' remains. This led to an archaeological excavation that lasted until 2013. An ancillary goal of the OCME's World Trade Center operation was to recover any personal effects of World Trade Center victims remaining on site in order to continue the ongoing victim identification process. OCME did give the museum several excavated artifacts from this operation that had no value to the victim identification process. These were effectively the last artifacts removed from the site and transferred to what was by then the 9/11 Memorial Museum. The primary objectives of the OCME archaeologists directing the field work was to implement archaeologically based strategies that would facilitate the thorough, systematic, and timely identification, assessment, excavation, and documentation of all areas potentially containing World Trade Center material. Archaeological methodology such as test pit excavations, preliminary artifact assessment, and stratigraphic excavation techniques were used to define and investigate the designated areas. The archaeological methodology also included standard forensic protocols regarding evidence handling, chain of custody, and tracking. This line shows representative finds by the OCME at that time, in addition to artifacts representing the technology of 2001, like the film strip at left in the museum's collection. There are also those things from the 19th century, like this doll, we believe to be an example of the then popular Frozen Charlotte. OCME excavated until they reached a recognizably 19th century layer or fill to be sure there were no more possible remains to be found. The 9/11 Memorial Museum holds several thousand artifacts that were recovered from the Trade Center. Many unusual conditions influence the stewardship of 9/11 realia. It is a given that as conservators, we must contend with the inherent ephemerality of many materials not produced to stand the test of time, and we must respect the historical integrity of damage, scratches, tears, dents, corrosion, dirt, scorches, and fractures in our work preserving this collection. The marks reflect what they are, loss, the loss of people and things. The preservation of some artifacts damaged we have an obligation to uphold the museum's mission to commemorate and provide evidence of the violence so that we can learn from it. And we seek to protect the memories of people that we associate with the event and that which have been shared with us. But also bound with artifacts is the experience of collecting and preserving, representing a democracy of voices and how artifacts have been used to help make meaning. Materials like paper survive the collapse of the towers in huge amounts. The great paradox of paper's survival as compared to large pieces of steel is that it is an inherently fragile material, especially the inexpensive commercially manufactured papers utilized in contemporary office environments. Receipts, bank statements, trading slips, business cards, and handwritten notes were recovered in all sizes and conditions. Many papers expelled from the towers drifted before settling onto nearby streets and rooftops, like these examples instinctively collected by John McGuire, who lived at 71 Warren Street, blocks from the Trade Center, within hours of the collapse. The crumpled condition and scorched edges of this monogram stationery are subtle manifestations of the evil humans are capable of unleashing on one another. Each surviving paper with a North or South Tower provenance is singular as an object of contemplation, like this playing card. Mickey Cross, the firefighter pictured here, and his unit were on the 23rd floor of the North Tower when they received an order to evacuate the building following the collapse of the South Tower. Making it to the 3rd floor of stairwell B, he heard an incredible noise and felt a turbulent wind. He reflected that he braced himself by, quote, trying to make myself as small as possible for shelter. I literally tried to squeeze myself into my helmet, end quote. Met by darkness moments later, he was amazed to be alive. Cross and 13 others in the same location, among the few inside the building during its collapse to survive, were rescued several hours later. As he staggered to the FDNY's West Street command post, he confronted a minefield of twisted steel reflecting, quote, everything from the offices was pulverized like a blizzard, except a 2 of clubs playing card, which I found in the debris, end quote. He put it in his pocket and continued on to the command post, where he crossed his name off of a list of about 400 missing firemen presumed dead. A self-described William Shakespeare buff, Cross later wrote on the face of the card, stand the hazard of the die, and carried it as a talisman. Other paper artifacts, like this cluster of personal correspondence, invoke more prosaic but endearing details of human life that animated these skyscrapers. This collection of keepsakes belonging to Hazam Gamal, fortunately, never made it to work that day. As a result of the collapse, the papers traveled from the 34th floor inside a filing cabinet next to his desk to what remained of the 3rd sub-basement level of the South Tower. They were rescued at Ground Zero, begrimed yet intact, months later after 9/11 by Ray Coleman, a construction worker. Preserving them in a way that best reflected the arc of their history meant leaving them clipped together, as they had been saved by Gamal and more improbably found by Coleman. The choice is not optimal for conserving the integrity of each individual sheet of paper or the words written on them. However, the artifact's significance resides in the survival of the whole aggregate of documents, joined together by a simple binder clip. For Coleman, the discovery of the letters was extraordinary because their ownership could be ascertained, and in his words, quote, everything on the pile was just so pulverized, end quote. These salvaged papers were among the earliest donations received by the museum. Most incredible may be the survival of this piece of copy paper, which, other than its creases and folds, was recovered with its extraordinary message intact. It was found outside the World Trade Center before the South Tower fell by an evacuee and given to someone at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as they were fleeing the area. The process for preserving works like this is principally about the careful control of its environment and limiting exposure to light in a gallery context because of its vulnerable organic materiality. But because of its singularity, the artifact is an important part of the historical exhibition narrative. A replica, which sometimes are used in museums, or exhibition copy, though, can't convey the same humanity that this original invokes. The note poses a great dilemma. How do we balance preservation and access? At the museum, we also must reconcile how to approach an equally common condition to damage, the presence of World Trade Center dust, which uniquely resonates with people. While the dust can contain hazardous components, including lead, man-made vitreous fibers, and asbestos, the patina of it on objects can be a crucial part of the narratives they convey as witnesses to a profoundly tragic event. For some, the dust is considered a defining record of the day and was extensively photographed and saved. As you can see, the public was collecting dust and dust-covered objects as mementos, and the museum's collection contains numerous examples of the dust itself in various containers. It has also taken on a commemorative function. For some, the dust contained the microscopic essence of precious people, imbuing ash borne from the World Trade Center with a tragic, reverent connotation. Dr. Jan Ramirez, the current chief curator of the museum, recalled being told by many people at the World Trade Center on 9/11 that they could not wash their clothing because of their reverence for the dust. For example, a nurse stationed near Ground Zero recounted how she buried her dust-covered uniform out of respect. Many pieces of clothing worn in 9/11 are preserved intact in the collection, along with the stories that animate them, including the pants seen here worn by Greg Gully, an EMT, who self-deployed to the Trade Center after the collapse of the South Tower. He stayed on site for 4 days and donated the pants worn during his response effort in 2012. Never having been washed, he gives clear instructions on how they should remain uncleaned, recognizing the memorial significance of the ash. Finally, and perhaps the most far-reaching, is the health and safety concern. The dust is a toxic substance, which continues to claim lives with an alarming frequency to this day. Because the dust presents potential health and safety risks to museum personnel, the museum often must confront the competing interests of preservation versus hazard removal. Preserving dust is rarely a museum conservation function, but for the 9/11 Memorial Museum, it's often an essential aspect of maintaining an object's cultural resonance. It also should be noted that the collection policies at the museum mandate that all artifacts recovered from Ground Zero are considered potentially hazardous and require special handling, storage, and exhibition procedures. Thus emerges the dichotomy between dust preservation as part of the collection and removal as a part of a hazard mitigation plan. The examples of clothing and other personal effects we'll now turn to were all exposed to the dust resulting from the tower's collapse, but the dust was not universally preserved. The patina of dust on these artifacts has both been considered a crucial part of the narratives they convey, as well as a physical or emotional hazard to be removed. Prior to acquisition, whether to remove the dust lies with the individual. In contrast to the preservation of World Trade Center dust on the right, the video at left is an artwork demonstrating the reverent cleansing of dust made by the daughter of a New York City firefighter who responded to the crisis on 9/11. His fate remained unknown until later that day. We see the artist fervently washing her father's soiled shirt. The sounds of scrubbing are interwoven, which I'm sorry you can't hear right now, with exchanges recorded on her father's FDNY radio. Without the perspective of distance, the act of washing reflected a practical need. The firefighter wore it again at Ground Zero to continue the search for his missing colleagues. Still, the artist was sensitive to the possibility of what soiled her father's clothing. For many who escaped the towers as they collapsed, the dust was a contaminant to be removed. Diane DeFontis, a Brooklyn native, had worked at the World Trade Center for nearly 20 years in 2001. Diane is seen here in front of the Koenig Sphere in July that year, coincidentally wearing the same outfit that she wore on 9/11. She worked on the 89th floor of the North Tower and generally arrived before her colleagues. In an oral history, Diane recalled that she was thrown from her chair soon after reaching her office that morning when Flight 11 struck just 4 floors above her. As a survivor of the 1993 bombing, Diane understood the potential danger and prepared to evacuate. During her egress, she used a flashlight to guide her way through the stairwells littered with debris and filled with water from broken pipes. Her white work pants were soon reflected the treacherous conditions she faced, soaked with water that was, quote, black up to her knees, end quote. The South Tower had collapsed by the time she exited the building. Once outside, she traveled about 2 miles north until she reached Cabrini Hospital, where she found rescue workers had set up decontamination showers in the parking lot. After putting her soiled clothing in a bag, Diana was sprayed with a hose to remove the dust that covered her and went home in hospital scrubs. You can see the pristine condition of the clothes today do not reflect Diane's experience during her immediate evacuation, but indicate the following hours when she wanted nothing more than to clean herself of the toxins that she was exposed to. But not everyone who worked at the Trade Center was as fortunate as Diane. The items here represent the personhood of 25-year-old Andrea Lynn Haberman, who in 2001 was living in Chicago, where she worked for Car Futures. On September 10th, she flew to New York City for a business trip to work in the company's office on the 92nd floor of the North Tower. On the morning of 9/11, she arrived at the office a little after 8 a.m. After the plane struck the building, Andrea and all present on Car's 92nd floor office were trapped. These items were found at Ground Zero months later and returned to her family. The purse was battered and covered in dust, though its contents, including her pictured IDs, were not. Because of their condition, her father did not have the heart to show them to her mother. He stored items for years out of sight as powerful objects of reverence for him. They were donated to the museum in 2011. Objects like this present challenges because their owner cannot articulate their significance. And it can be difficult for museum workers to look beyond a victim's damaged belongings to the life that the person led before tragedy befell them. We often rely on family to place the items in context and illuminate their meaning. As stewards, we are protecting the memory shared with us and, in a sense, are participating in an act of healing. While the dust on this purse will remain, it is worth noting that in cases where World Trade Center dust obscures the pictures of victims on their IDs, considerations about the dust's preservation can be more complicated. For the 25,000 residents of Lower Manhattan in September 2001, World Trade Center dust has a very different meaning. Their homes were made unlivable by the hazardous debris. Today, images, many taken by the residents themselves, are all that remains of World Trade Center dust in this context. Without them, it would be hard to appreciate the scale of ruin. Residents were displaced for months or years. Many lost all of their belongings and continue to lose their lives from dust-related health effects. While this picture represents just one family's story, what it portrays is universal to many of their neighbors. In this scenario, there was only one way to view the dust as a health hazard. Oops. All Lower Manhattan buildings exposed to World Trade Center debris were remediated before they could be reoccupied. In some rare instances, the dust in apartments was preserved in a contained way, like in this vacuum bag, which the OCME office radiographed to ensure it contained no human remains before entering the museum's collection. For those who have no lived memory of the event, images like those of the Gupta's apartment are compelling because we can see how the destruction was experienced through the eyes of individuals. Although many significant aspects of the museum collection that were eyewitnesses to the day were inquired in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, some survivors who collected or saved their own things may just be deciding to gift them and their memories to the museum. For example, the museum recently received a gift from a survivor who was at the Chambers Street post office near the World Trade Center just before Flight 11 struck the North Tower. Aziz Hassan is an attorney whose office was then on Lower Broadway. He made a special trip to the post office that morning to purchase stamps that commemorate two important Muslim festivals, which had just been issued days before. He was happy. Hassan had lobbied several years earlier for a Muslim-themed stamp, and so was especially excited that his efforts had led to this historic outcome. He purchased over $1,000 worth of stamps that morning with the intent of distributing sheets to his friends and family. He was caught in a deluge of debris from the collapsing South Tower. On his train ride home, he recalled how none of his fellow passengers acknowledged him, despite his visibly distressed state, except the photographer that took this picture of him, who sat with him and learned his story. He appreciated immediately the effect this day would have on Muslims and has poignantly reflected, quote, "I was not responsible, but now I have made responsible in more than one way. The debris that hit me left physical marks, but part of the debris was also the remains of innocent people that were also seeking a resting place. I can't explain it, but the burden is so heavy that it weakens me," end quote. According to his son, who was in the 7th grade at the time, he was so shell-shocked after writing home that he initially couldn't speak. His son and he hung an American flag outside his family's house on the evening of 9/11, which was typically reserved by the family for display on the 4th of July. Along with the stamps, he donated the clothes he wore on 9/11 and the post office receipt. His shoes, another important category of artifact in the museum's collection, plays a vital role in survivor stories and helps to define the conditions at Ground Zero. The physical state of the person's shoes can help convey the physical challenges they encountered, and in some ways, the psychological ones too. The museum's preservation protocols aim to respect the meaning of the shoes for the wearer. People deal with trauma in deeply personal ways. As I have hoped I have demonstrated, the most significant decisions about the collection and the condition of artifacts now in the museum's collection were largely made before they were acquired. Staff, therefore, did not have to make the difficult choices about, for example, whether or not to clean an artifact from Ground Zero. However, for objects acquired with World Trade Center dust, the decision-making process about whether to preserve it involves considering historical accuracy and narrative necessity. Also critical is input from various stakeholders, including victims' families, first responders, and survivors, many of whom the curatorial staff now count as trusted friends. Moreover, while 9/11 is still a lived memory, there is an opportunity to continue to collect documentation and fill any narrative holes that may be missing. As conservators, we must reconcile these perspectives within our plans regarding the removal of World Trade Center dust. Compared with the initial collecting effort, conversations on the removal of it are now less frequent. Even faced with an apparent health hazard, decisions are difficult to make, particularly when complicated by our own biases. As a profession, we are cautious about making even the slightest material change, including sampling, so as not to alter an artifact's integrity. This is especially relevant with much of this collection because its meaning is still evolving. As we've passed the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we now see it as a historical event. We can now better see how people's experiences and expertise affected what and how things were saved, and how our perspectives are still evolving. The museum's chief curator recently shared that during her early years of collecting around 9/11, she was so focused on the event's trauma and its residues that she couldn't see the historical authenticity or interpretive value of artifacts from the heyday if they had been cleaned or restored by their owners, such as was seen in that previous slide. For example, why would Diane DeFontes launder the clothes she had worn, given the compelling patina of wear and tear they acquired? In other words, although these survivors had reached the next chapter in the story the day after, as a curator, her aesthetics were stuck on 9/11. Experience is not linear, and objects' meanings are bound in our unique journeys through time with them. Methodologies of collecting and preserving artifacts born with meaning as a result of trauma is complex. Cultural institutions and other entities charged with this work must be able to effectively communicate with affected communities, including victims' relatives, survivors, responders, and witnesses. As stewards of this work, we are not only helping to protect memories, but as I've said earlier, are in some ways participating in an act of healing. Because of the particular emotional gravity and community resonance, we must respect the beauty of difference and how institutions may tackle this work. There may have been distinct strategies for collecting and memorialization around events since 9/11, and this is important that we continue to learn from one another. Thank you so much. I also just want to acknowledge the first three people on this slide. The first, Dr. Jan Sedler-Ramirez, who worked at the New York Historical Society in 2001 and is now the chief curator at the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And a lot of what I've learned about this collection has come directly through her. And the second two individuals are conservators who I've done a lot of collaborative research with on this topic. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. And if anyone has a question that they would like to come down and ask at either of the two microphones, they're welcome to do that. Or if they have a question on the quick live chat, they can send that through as well.
Hi there. I was working at 111 Wall Street, and God willing, I wasn't there that day. I was in our Connecticut office, so I missed it. But one of the things, as far as artifacts, I specifically remember when I did come back to work at Wall Street and in the area was the Century 21 dress shop. And I don't know if you want to touch on that or not, if you remember how they enclosed that all with glass so people could see, because that was directly across from the Trade Center. Is it still there? I haven't been back. I couldn't go back. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your reflection. So there wasn't time enough to kind of talk about everything today. It's the impact in that one day and kind of the cultural production that ensued after the day itself was enormous. So the one thing that I really didn't fully unpack was the spontaneous memorials and the other tributes throughout the city, which were ubiquitous everywhere, and you probably have all seen now after COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter movement. But there was a few different viewing platforms, a family platform, as well as a family room, as well as a platform for the public, because people really wanted to have a place to go to kind of honor the victims and kind of process their own grief. And as we know, grief is not linear, so everyone, it kind of communicated that, whether through words or things in very different ways. But no, that's not there anymore, and There are aspects of it in different collections, though.
Lisa, I wonder if you could talk about how many objects that are in the collection are in storage versus on view, and what your storage facilities are like. Because we heard from Joe McNally, the photographer, earlier, that his Faces of Ground Zero project is now housed in one of your facilities upstate New York.
Yeah, we actually have a large collection of his Polaroids, which are really fabulous objects. They are, as you might have learned earlier, one-to-one scale, and they represent, I believe, the last camera of its kind to be able to produce such photographs, which seems unusual today, where documentations and photos are ubiquitous and so easy to take, but they're really powerful. Our collection has approximately 20,000 physical objects and 60,000 digital. So that can comprise archival records, photographs, video, that sort of thing. And we don't have a large portion of our collection stored at the museum. We have 2 storage facilities. One is in New Jersey at Man of Fine Arts, and then we have another storage facility sort of in the Albany area where several of his photographs are stored, because that's where a lot of our oversized artifacts are, and those are, I think, about 12 feet tall each. On view in the museum right now, I would estimate between 1,000 to 1,250 artifacts on view of, as I mentioned, 20,000 physical ones. There's, of course, I talked a little bit about the fact that the site itself was built around the archaeology that was saved of the remains of the original site. So in Daniel Leapston's site master plan, one of the major choices was to save part of the slurry wall, which is a bathtub which encompasses the perimeter of the campus. And the reason for it is because the water line is at ground level, essentially. So that's a way in which to reach bedrock, which is 70 feet below ground, so that you can anchor the building's foundations, which is essential for all skyscrapers. So in terms of our facilities and storage, like many museums or most museums, they have environmental control in order to best preserve the collection, kind of limit or kind of trying to limit aging because of environmental factors. And in terms of square footage, I think we have about 15,000 square feet or 15 to 20,000 square feet of storage.
Thank you so much for your talk here this evening. If we could all join in thanking Lisa Conte for her presentation.